Hello! Can you guys see me? Hear me? Everything okay? I'm just gonna set it up on my iPad so I can see down here. That way once I turn the camera I can still see the angle and everything that you guys are seeing. Oh, perfect. There we go. Hello! Good morning or good afternoon. Can you guys see and hear me okay? Just want to make sure before I get started. Awesome. Okay, perfect. It looks like we got some people coming on now. I just want to make sure that... Okay, awesome. Hello! Yay! Okay, awesome. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you so much to Paul and David. I'm so honored to be a part of this event. I think it's really, really awesome. I've enjoyed watching all of the demonstrations, and I can't wait to watch the rest of them later today. It's such a cool idea just to kind of bring our whole community together. I know I've been missing seeing all of my cake friends and all of my sugar artist friends, so this is a really cool way to not only watch them, but to get to kind of interact and talk to everybody in the comments. It's super, super fun. So I'm very excited to be a part of this. Yeah, I'm Sidney Galpern. I own SeeMeCakes.com, and I'm the inventor of See Me Isomalt, which is a pre-cooked ice malt. I'm going to show you guys some ice malt techniques today. I've been doing this for about 13 years, as you guys were saying a little bit before, and I'm also a professional chocolatier and cake designer, but I specialize in ice malts. So that is what I'm going to show you guys today. So we are going to be making a blown ice malt peacock here. I have my example I'll hold up so you guys can see my sculpture. So this would be a perfect cake topper. It would be basically a display that you can use. It would also be just really good for dissecting the techniques that I'm going to show you and using them on all different kinds of projects. So I just thought I'd show you a project with a wide array, a range of techniques, and then obviously you can use those techniques however you most use things for your pieces. So we're going to be doing the casting ice malt for pouring into molds. We're going to be doing our blowing and hand sculpting and pulling for the actual body of the peacock. Awesome! Hello Ireland, hello in Scotland, Cape Town. Oh my gosh, this is so cool. Yeah, so if you guys have any questions, make sure that you put them in the comments in the chat section. I'm going to be tilting the camera down, but I do have my iPad set up down here so that I can read through your questions as I go. And then I also have both of my parents. They actually work full-time for me now, and they are going to be here in just a couple minutes, and they will be reading off questions. So if you have any questions about what I'm doing, make sure that you write them in the chat, and we will be going through them, and I'll go through them afterwards too and respond to any that I may have missed. But yeah, we will go ahead and get started if you guys are ready. Awesome! That's so exciting! I love seeing everybody. Hello Ileana! Thank you so much for getting up early to watch. Oh my gosh. Awesome. Okay, so we are going to go ahead. I'm going to flip my camera down so you guys can see what I'm going to be doing. So I'm just going to... Give me 1 second to get this all set up here. Alright, so just bear with me for a second while I get everything adjusted to make sure that you can see okay. Alright, I'm just going to wait for my iPad to catch up here. Alright. Perfect. Let me see. Let me just rotate this the other way so that we're looking the same direction. Alright. Okay, there we go. Awesome. So I'm just going to set this guy back here so I don't bump into him. Okie dokie. So first off, what we're going to be using, so this is Sidney Isomalt. This is my kind of recipe that I developed for Isomalt. So Isomalt does start out in a powder or a granule. That does have to be tempered or cooked to a very specific recipe. Now I do have my recipe listed on my website for anyone who's interested in learning more about tempering it from scratch, but it is a little bit tricky. It takes some kind of practice and getting used to, and a lot of people just don't want to do it. So that's why I developed Sidney Isomalt. It's kind of similar to tempering chocolate, whereas you have to get it to the exact right temperatures, and 1 or 2 degrees can affect the texture a lot. So that's why I kind of have this pre-cooked and ready to go so that you don't have to worry about any of that. So all you do with the pre-cooked Isomalt, once it's already in a hard candy form, is you just melt it for 30 seconds and then 15-second intervals in the microwave, and that's it. It's super easy. It's basically a sugar-free hard candy, so just like a sugar-free Jolly Rancher, or you know, anything that you want hard candy that doesn't have the sugar in it, which is really nice. But it is 100% edible. Isomalt is made from beets, so it's a byproduct of beet sugar, and it is going to be completely edible and completely safe for anyone who can't have sugar, which is always nice. So it just starts out clear, and I just have some pre-melted in the microwave. So I'm just going to grab that out here. Alright. So I just have a big bowl of it right here. As you can see, it's all pretty much melted. I want to show you guys how to mix in some color. So we're going to be starting off with making a base for our Peacock to sit on, and we're going to do that with gold. So depending on what kind of color that you add in, it's going to give you different effects. If you want a transparent color, you want to add a liquid color. So that's going to be a water or alcohol-based airbrush color. If you want more of an opaque effect, or obviously a shimmery effect, you can use either luster dust or petal dust. So I'm using Wet n Gold luster dust here, and I'm just going to mix some of that into my Isomalt. So I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit. Depending on how much you add, obviously will adjust the intensity of your color. So I'm just going to start with a little sprinkle and stir that in. Our base is just going to be gold, and then we'll be mixing in some blue for our actual Peacock here in a little bit. So you can see that beautiful shine that the Isomalt is getting. I'm going to mix in a tiny bit more, just so it's a little bit more opaque and stands out better. Alright, so you can see as I'm working with the Isomalt, I am being very, very careful. Remember, Isomalt is hot. It's about 300 degrees Fahrenheit, so you want to make sure that you are wearing gloves. Please don't follow my bad example. I've been working with this for about 13 years, like I said. My hands do not have any more heat sensitivity left. I can't feel heat in my hands. So it's easier for me to demonstrate in more detail without the gloves, but I definitely recommend wearing a cotton glove and then a nitrile glove over top of that, and that's going to protect your hands. I know a lot of people are intimidated by Isomalt because it is so hot, but if you make cakes or you bake or you cook, you work with ovens and stoves all the time, right? So you're used to hot stuff. Just be careful, pay attention, you won't have any problem. Okay, so I have my Isomalt all colored here. I'm just going to put it off to the side. Now, I'm just making a display piece, so I'm not going to add any flavor, but you absolutely could add in an oil-based flavor. That is going to work really well with Isomalt, so if you wanted to add any flavoring, I just use like the Lorraine candy oils, or any oil-based flavoring is going to work. Now to make our base, what I'm going to use to make kind of a free-form shape, these are my Sidney Flex Forms. So they're basically just tubes of silicone, and I'm going to shape them into a teardrop shape for this, but you could do any shape. You can use multiple and do squares or triangles, pretty much anything that you want. Okay, so I'm just kind of turned it onto its side. I'm pouring this on a coated Teflon sheet, so it is going to release easy. I like using this compared to using a silicone mat underneath, because silicone can sometimes bubble up from the heat. So these are nice and thin and they won't bubble up. So I'm just going to pour enough to cover the bottom. So I'm just slowly letting the Isomalt fill out to the edges. Okay, and like I said, just enough to cover the bottom. I don't have to fill it all the way to the top. Perfect. So now before I go ahead and let this just cool and sit, I'm going to pop any bubbles because hot air rises, right? So from stirring it, you may have some air mixed in. Now our tiles start out super crystal clear, so there's no air mixed into it to begin with, but sometimes from stirring it you do get some little bubbles. So because this has powder in it, you're not going to see the bubbles as much, so I'm not super worried about that. Sometimes I will re-microwave my Isomalt after I stir in color if it's a clearer color, so that hot air rises and it will all boil itself out. But for this, I'm just going to pop any stray bubbles that may have risen to the top now. So I just let it sit for a minute as I was talking, and then I go ahead and just swipe my torch right over the surface. and that will be perfect, okay? Now you can see that beautiful shine and shimmer from the luster dust, so you could put a design in that if you wanted to with a toothpick or a tool, but I'm just going to go ahead and leave it because I think it looks really nice, and I will put this off to the side to cool at room temperature. You don't want to put it in the fridge or the freezer because the moisture and the condensation can affect it. So I'm just going to leave it at room temperature for probably about 20 minutes or so until it comes completely solid and firm to the touch with a toothpick, not with your finger. Alright, you guys doing good? Awesome. So again, if you have any questions, write them in the chat, and I have Mom and Dad here, Michelle and Mike, and they will be able to read them out as we go, and I have my iPad set up next to me so I can kind of keep an eye on the chat if you guys have any questions. Okay, now, like I said, you can also mix in airbrush colors, so I'm going to be adding in a royal blue airbrush color. That's going to give us a really dark, beautiful blue. And it's also going to react really well with the gold and give us almost like a green tint, which will be perfect for a peacock since they have those blues and greens. So I just added in a couple drops, I think about 3 drops. I'm going to add maybe 1 more. Perfect. Right in. And I'm going to leave it this kind of greenish tint at first here for when we pour our feathers. Okay, so you can really see that beautiful gold finish now, kind of swirling around within that blue. Alright, so now we are going to go ahead and pour some feathers to get them cooling as well. So to make my feathers, I'm using silicone molds. So these are just a variety. You can use any silicone mold. They don't need to be greased or powdered. You do want to just make sure that they're high heat, so they can go up to about 400 degrees, and that obviously they're food safe. So I'm just using these peacock feather molds here, as you can see. This one's going to be for the wings, and this one is going to be for the tail feathers. And I'm just going to pour a little bit of Isomalt into the mold and then spread it around using my silicone tool, or you can also use a toothpick.
Sydney, somebody's asking if you can use gel colors.
You don't want to use gel colors when coloring Isomalt, when mixing it in, because the gelatin can actually break down the Isomalt and not allow it to dry properly. So I recommend an edible airbrush color, which is going to be a water or alcohol base, or a powdered color, just no gels. Now you can use gels painted on top rather than mixed in, so after on your finished piece you could use the gels at that point, thin down a little bit to paint on top. Alright, so I'm just pouring from the center and just letting the Isomalt run out. I'm not worrying about filling it all the way to the top because I don't want my feathers to be too chunky, so I'm just spreading the Isomalt that I have put in there. If I don't quite have enough, I can just add a little bit more. It'll bond right together. I could also scoop and drip it with my tool.
Sid, somebody asked alcohol-based or water-based, or does it matter?
You can use either. The one that I'm using is water-based, but I've used alcohol-based before too, and it is totally fine. Alright. So see how I'm just spreading into my molds. I'm not worrying about rough edges or anything like that because it's super easy to clean these up afterwards. So I'm going to show you guys that. So I'm just going to fill the cavities and then go ahead and let those cool. These are not quite as thick as the base, so they're not going to take as long to cool. And you can actually also take these out a little bit early and then bend them and shape them as well. So we're not going to let these cool all the way. I'm just going to go ahead and put them off to the side to cool for a couple minutes. To cool all the way, they'd probably take about 5 to 10 minutes depending on the temperature of your room. But I'm going to try and kind of remember to take them out a minute or two early. Okay, I'm going to add 1 or 2 more drops of color into my Isomalt now for the body of the peacock, just to kind of differentiate it a little bit from the feathers. So I'm just mixing in.
Dawn says hi.
Hi, Dawn.
Can't wait to watch you later.
Yes. Alright. Okay, so that's just a tiny bit darker now. I'm going to switch over, so I have a Silpat mat here, but for when doing my pulling and sculpting, I like to use a little bit thinner silicone mat. So this is going to work really well with folding. Yeah, this will be fun.
That's well loved.
Yes, this is a well-loved mat here, as you can see from my little burn marks, but it still works totally fun. Alright, so basically this is just a silicone mat as well, but it's a baking mat, so I'm going to pour the Isomalt out. We're going to do our body for our Peacock now. So I'm pouring the Isomalt out onto the mat.
And with mats and molds, do you have to, prepare it with anything?
You don't have to with silicone. If you're using a hard candy plastic or a metal mold, you do have to grease it with some cooking spray, just some oil. But with silicone, generally you do not have to. So you see how to incorporate and cool down the Isomalt into more of a clay that I can sculpt with, I'm folding it. So I'm just folding the edges, edge to edge here, and folding in lots of cool air. And that is just going to thicken it, and it's going to react sort of like dough. So when when dough starts out, it's kind of crumbly and all over, but when it comes together, it all comes to a ball, and it stops sticking when it's ready. That's what this is going to do. It's just going to all come together and stop sticking to the mat once I am done. So I'm just going to keep folding edge to edge. So I'm making sure every time that I line up this edge of the puddle with that edge. And then you can see already that the edges are starting to thicken. It's all starting to kind of congregate together and hold its shape. I'm going to start going a little faster. I do like to move over on my table, especially because I am on a metal table here. I like to have another silicone mat like this one underneath to insulate the heat a little bit better, but it cools faster if you move it to a cool spot every few folds. So you can see now when I start going a little quicker, it's all pulling together. And like I said, my goal to this is just to get it to release and not be sticky anymore. So I can still see that it is sticking to the mat, so I'm going to keep going. And I'm just folding, again, edge to edge, but I'm not worrying about direction. I'm not worrying about certain temperature or a certain amount of times of folding. I really just go by texture. Because the Isomalt was already tempered, I don't have to worry about temperature anymore. I just have to worry about the texture and how cool or warm I want it to be for what I'm doing.
Sid, I'm not able to post the tips and tricks. Can you post it after?
Yes, I can. I have a tips and tricks sheet for working with Isomalt, and so I will post that in the comments after I'm finished. I can go back and post that. And I'll also have it on my page too. Okay, so see how it's not sticky anymore? It's kind of completely releasing from the mat. It still is very soft, so you can see if I were to sculpt anything into it, it's just going to immediately blob back down. So I want to make sure that I cool it a little bit further before I start working with it. So to do that, I'm stretching and folding it. So this is where the name pulled sugar or pulled Isomalt comes in, is you're pulling air into it. And you can see those beautiful streaks and striations of the air folding in. That's what's going to make it a little bit more opaque if you were using a clear color, and it's going to give it that beautiful satin finish. You will see those streaks in the finished piece, so I am making sure that I'm stretching in one direction. I'm not twisting it up or kneading it. I'm just keeping them nice and smooth.
Sydney, somebody asked if it's still hot.
Yes, it is. It's still going to be about, when I'm finished pulling it and I get it to the texture I like, it's still about 150 degrees Fahrenheit, so it's still quite warm. I still recommend wearing gloves at this point, but it's definitely not going to be a liquid anymore. Alright, so I can see that it's holding its shape a little bit better now. I'm still going to cool it down just a tiny bit more. Now, if you're working with a heat lamp next to you, that's great. You can use just a 250 watt bulb is what we use here in the US underneath a heat lamp hood. I'm not going to be working with that today just because I'm doing my pieces pretty quickly, but sometimes I'll pull a whole bunch of Isomalt and then just cut pieces off from under the lamp once I'm ready. Alright. So really quickly, I want to just show you guys taking one of these feathers out. I'm just going to let that sit for a second. When it's still a little bit warm, I can fold it and shape it. So you see that? I'll show you cleaning up those edges in a little bit, but I just wanted to catch it before the Isomalt hardened. So you can see I just kind of pulled it out of the mold, and then I will let it set the rest of the way. I just like to give those a little bit more shape so that they're not so flat. Gives it more movement, a little bit more personality. Perfect. Alright, so going back to our peacock body here, I'm just going to roll it into a ball and then get my pump ready. So this is the pump that I like. It's super flexible and easy to use. It has a metal end. I like to make sure that I use a pump with a valve on it because it makes the control a lot better, and so that the air doesn't suck back out from the end of the pipe. So that is what I'm using. I do season my pumps, so I basically just put cuts in it with the scissors and then dip it in some liquid Isomalt when I first have a fresh pump, and then eventually the Isomalt will just stick onto the end there. And it will be seasoned so that it sticks on a little bit better. So you can see that I just heated up the end of my pipe, And then I'm just pinching and attaching and sealing my Isomalt down onto the pipe. Now before I inflate this, I want to start to give it some shape, because really the only part that's going to have the air in it is going to be the body. The neck and the head are not going to be inflated, just because it would be very hard to get that perfectly even, and also we don't want it to be too thin there, because then it will be way more fragile. So you see how I'm just kind of pinching towards the top and starting to stretch out a neck? I want to leave his head a little bit more bulbed, since his head would be bigger than his neck. I don't need to do it completely, I just want to start it because it's going to continue to stretch since this is still warm as I inflate air into it. So now I'm going to add 1 pump of air. I'm not going to do too much all at once because you don't want the air to be uneven or to go all off to one side, so I'm just going to give it 1 pump of air and then wait about 10 seconds before I add any more to see if the air goes in. So it'll look like nothing's happening, but I promise it is. Oop, there it goes. It just builds up that pressure, so you don't want to just pump, 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 pump right away. You want to build up the pressure slowly. So I saw a tiny bit of puff go kind of up here. It's just like glass, you kind of have to keep it moving and rotating as you go so that it doesn't fall into one spot. Now I can see the air is kind of going to the top here, so I am going to cool that off a little bit. You want a nice even temperature so that it's going to have an even texture. So I'm going to go ahead and press the warmer spots, or the softer spots where I can see the air going to, on a cool surface, in this case my nice cool mat. You can see I just moved my warm mat out of the way there. And then just inflating with little bits of air, kind of stretching the neck a little bit more. The key with Isomalt is to just kind of go in small increments. You can always add more air, you can always stretch it more, but you can't take it away. So I'm just adding tiny bits at a time to make sure that I don't overdo it.
Sidney, somebody asked, Danica asked, could you mold without the pump, and what would be the difference? Just heavier?
Hi Danica, yes, you absolutely could. That's really the only difference, is you would just have a more solid, heavy piece, which sometimes is good. Sometimes you want it a little bit stronger, depending on if you're putting something on top of it, or what your project is, but you absolutely can just hand sculpt this. That's where I would use the lamp a lot, because you can keep it warm and soft. But yeah, you absolutely can just hand sculpt this like you would with modeling chocolate or gum paste. Alright, so I'm starting to get into the proportions that I'm going to be happy with for my finished piece. So I'm going to start to give him a little bit of shape. So I'm going to pick out where I want his back to sit, and start kind of using my mat as an anchor here. Now peacocks, the focal point on them is really their tail, right? But you don't really want to just show the tail, because you don't just want him sitting with his back to the front of the cake or the front of the centerpiece, right? So I'm going to kind of have his neck angled back and down, looking behind him a little bit, almost like he's peeking back over his shoulder. And that is going to just give us kind of the shape, so you can see, give him this elegant dip in his neck. I'm adding little bits more air when I start to kind of shape it and puff out that shape. I'm going to make his neck a tiny bit longer, a little bit more defined. And then I also have my battery operated fan here that I'm going to start to cool him as I get his final shape.
Sidney, someone is asking what the pump is, the name is, a See Me Sugar pump?
Yes, this is the See Me Sugar pump, so it's the one that I designed that I find works the best. But the main thing is going to be that valve, so that's what is really important for me when working, because a lot of projects that I do, I open the valve or I leave it closed, or again, it just keeps the air from sucking back out. Okay, so you can see I'm kind of twisting his chest forward and then just tucking his head back a little bit. I want to make sure I leave room for his beak. And then I'm anchoring it to the base because I do want him to sit flat. I'm not really worrying about what his tail and the bottom half of his body looks like, because we're going to be covering all of that with the feathers. So as I'm finishing this up and just adding the final little bits of air and shaping, I'm rotating him in front of this cool fan here. And I just want to make sure that he's completely solid before I take it off the pump, because right now he's still hot, he's still pliable, right? So if I take it off and set it down, he's just going to completely collapse. So I want to make sure that he's nice and solid and going to hold his shape. So I'm just cooling it and rotating it here. Alright, so You guys can see some of his shape starting to form. I'm going to add just a teeny bit more air. Beautiful. Okay, so he's almost solid. I'm going to give it one more minute here. Awesome. So just kind of adding little bits more air. You don't want to add too much air when it's getting too hard, because that's when it could pop, is when you're adding too much pressure and nothing's happening. So if you're pumping and it's not getting bigger and it feels like it's getting a lot stiffer, you want to go ahead and stop.
Sidney, how long does the sugar stay warm to shape with?
With my Isomalt, basically when you cook the Isomalt initially, when you temper it, the higher temperature you get it to, the faster it dries. So with my recipe, I actually cook it to the lowest possible temperature. So you're going to have a good like 5 to 10 minutes to work with it before it gets too solid. So it's going to dry very, very slow, and you have a lot of time. Now, the more you have on the end of your pump, the longer you have too, because it holds in more heat. So you have about 10 minutes or so.
Can you cool it in front of an air conditioning vent?
Yeah, you definitely could cool it in front of an air conditioning vent. I do recommend having your air conditioning on when working with Isomalt. Now, I'm based in Florida, so it is very, very humid, and I'm going to show you my trick to keeping everything nice and clear and shiny and not getting sticky or anything like that at the end. But I do make my Isomalt in a humid environment, so it is going to be used to that, and that does help as well.
What if your shape goes hard before you get it into the shape you want?
That is definitely a good question. So it really just comes with practice and getting more and more confident, and obviously as you get more confident, you get faster. So luckily with Isomalt, you can remelt this as many times as you want. I generally don't recommend reheating bubbles. You can reheat solid pieces with the torch a little bit or underneath the lamp, but really with blown pieces, it's better to just go ahead and take it off and remelt it and redo it, because you don't have any limit to how many times you can reuse this. There's no waste. So with blown pieces, rather than risking popping it or getting it uneven, it's going to be best to go ahead and just restart it and just use the same Isomalt again and recycle it. Alright, so he feels nice and solid now. You can see he's not bending or moving at all anymore, so I'm going to go ahead and take my Peacock off of the pipe. So to do that, I'm going to rest him down, which is another reason why you want to make sure that he's nice and solid so he doesn't get a dent. I'm going to go about an inch away from my Isomalt with my torch. Now I'm going to hold the pipe by the tube so that I don't burn my fingers, because the pipe is going to get hot. So if I heat for about 10-second intervals an inch away on the metal, metal conducts heat, so it's going to radiate that heat up into the Isomalt. And it just depends on how deep you have the pipe into the Isomalt and how thick it is. So you can see that that was not coming out yet. There's really no right or wrong amount of times to do this. You just want to keep heating until it slides out easily. You don't want to yank because you don't want to break your blown Isomalt piece that you just made. So I can see it's starting to go, but it's not easily falling out yet. So
Sidney, can you put blown pieces underneath the lamp to soften slightly to blow again?
I don't like to do that because the lamp is going to heat unevenly, so I prefer to just restart with my pieces. And there we go. So this is very hot. I'm going to put this off to the side, somewhere that I won't touch it for a couple of minutes while that cools down, and then I'm just going to use scissors and cut off that little end piece, and then seal it closed so that there's no opening and the moisture can't get in from the air. This little bit, like I said, I can just throw back in my bowl and remelt that. And there is the body of our peacock. So we have a nice base here that we'll go ahead and decorate all of our finished pieces onto. So I'm going to set him off to the side. All right. Okay, so I'm just grabbing back my silicone mat here that I was using before, and I'm going to pull a tiny bit more of the blue. So this is pretty thick, but it's actually going to work out faster if I pull this, since it has cooled down a pretty good amount. So I'm not going to reheat it. I'm just going to pour a tiny puddle, and we're going to use this to make his beak, his facial features. So I'm just going to pull this like before, and you'll notice this goes a lot faster now.
Sidney, Shannon is in New Zealand, and even though she sprayed it with glaze, it's still getting milky.
Hi, Shannon. So what can happen is you may have to do 2 coats of the glaze if you're in a super humid area. Also, just make sure that your air conditioning is on when you're working and that you glaze it right away. That's one of the biggest things. You don't want to wait at all. So as soon as this is all put together and all painted and finished, you want to glaze it as soon as humanly possible, and that way no moisture can get in, because once the moisture gets in, it's going to make it start getting sticky. Alright, so I'm just going to cut off a little piece here with my scissors. So like we were talking about before, you can just shape and sculpt pieces. You don't have to use the air. So I'm going to do his little beak, and we'll just paint it with some color later if we wanted to, but I'm just going to shape a little teardrop shape and cut this down into a triangle. I want to obviously make this the size of his face here. This is still a little bit warm, so I'm going to be able to go ahead and just attach this immediately. So you can see I just attach that on, or you can hit it with the torch. And then I already pre-made, because I didn't want to have the lamp set up, and these take a little bit longer to do. The lighting would have been completely thrown off if I had the lamp next to me. I already made his little crown pieces for his head. So these are basically just done the same way. I pulled a little bit of Isomalt, and then I shaped them into little lollipop shapes. And I'm just going to go ahead and attach those onto his head. I'm going to trim them a tiny bit thinner.
They said Donald is asking where he can get the bowls.
Hi, Donald. These bowls that I'm using are from Pampered Chef. They're awesome. They come with 3 different sizes, so it makes it super easy. Alright, so I'm going to just very lightly torch to attach them on. So I'm going to torch his head. Don't worry, he won't mind. And then just quickly press all of my pieces in, or you can hold the individual pieces with tweezers and torch them one by one if you want, but I'm just going to attach those on and then grab my fan to cool them in place really quick so that they don't fall, and then we will go ahead and start assembling him all together. Okay, these extra pieces I'll just throw back in the bowl and remelt. Beautiful.
Anything that you can do, Carrie is asking, anything you can do in sugar, can you do in Isomalt?
Yes, definitely. It's going to be pretty much the exact same techniques, except Isomalt is going to hold up a lot better. It's going to not be as, it's not going to melt or break down like sugar is as quickly from the humidity, and it's going to be a lot less temperamental and a lot easier to work with as far as texture goes. Alright, so we'll just set him off to the side. I'm going to grab my base that we poured before. So remember, test with a tool, not with your finger, just to make sure that it's not going to be hot. I'm going to just peel my flex form away and peel it off of my mat here, so you can see it just falls right off. If you have any rough edges, I can trim those with the scissors a little bit, and then I can torch over that edge to smooth it out. Now, as I was talking about before with these pieces here, if you have any rough edges that are kind of along just from spreading it and smoothing it into the mold, what I can do is flip them face down to protect their detail, and I'm just going to torch around the edges, and it all will just melt itself away. It'll smooth off and make perfect, easy, clean pieces. Now, if you have a really big spill or there were multiple cavities on the mold and you blended them all together, you can still do this step, and then you just take your scissors after about 10 or 15 seconds, pick these up, and you could cut off any excess pieces with the scissors. But you really only have to do that if they are super big chunks, because you can see all of the rough edges on these just smoothed away by themselves.
So, Sidney, can you talk a little bit more about the glazing? Everything starts to melt.
Yes, so basically we're going to spray here. I'll pop my Isomalt back in the microwave for my glue to put it together, and I'll talk about glazing. So at the very end, this is the glaze that I use. It's from PME, but you can use any clear edible glaze spray, and that is just going to spray onto my finished pieces. It's a nice clear, almost like an edible acrylic coat over the whole thing, so it's going to lock out any moisture and any humidity. You may have to do 2 coats depending on your area, but basically you just want to use the spray rather than the bottled glaze, because the bottled glaze I find paints on way too thick and can sometimes eat away the Isomalt or leave brush strokes and be streaky, so I like just a nice, thin, clear glaze at the end. Make sure you move all your tools out of the way. Cover your counter with plastic or anything that you can, or do it, outside if it's cool enough outside, and just make sure that it's all going to not get in any of your tools, because it is edible, but it doesn't like to come off of tools. So make sure that you just protect your work surface when you do that. Just going to smooth off that little spot there. Alright, so I'm using liquid Isomalt as a glue. So I just reheated. I'm going to pop it back in for just another 30 seconds or so. And I have some feathers already pre-made here so that I can just throw the whole thing together. So you can see I made these a couple of days ago, and they are not cloudy, they are not sticky, they haven't broken down or lost their shape. That is because of the glaze. So I just glazed them.
Someone said they can't get it in Australia, but I know Luke sells it. What's
Yes.
the name of his shop? Dawn, do you know what the name of his shop is?
Cake Decorating Solutions.
He has another brand, and it worked great. We used it.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be this brand. It can be any clear edible glaze. Just has to be the spray. Okay, so we are going to attach all of our pieces on now. So I'm just going to pour a tiny little puddle of my Isomalt glue. Isomalt is a great edible glue, even not for Isomalt. When I'm gluing heavy gum paste pieces together, or if I'm gluing pretty much anything together, I use Isomalt, anything edible. It's kind of like the hot glue of the sugar world. It's when you use clear, it's completely clear, so it's very hard to see. It's also going to dry almost instantly, so you can see now. That is not going anywhere, and it cools super, super fast. Alright, I'm just going to kind of make sure that there's no glue showing. And now I'm just going to position my feathers. So I'm going to kind of go in a cascading motion of starting with about 4 of them towards the bottom here. So I'm just going to dip and stick all of my pieces together using my glue. So 1, 2, 3, and of course this is all aesthetic, so if you're doing this on a cake, your peacock could be on the top of your cake, and then you can have all of these cascading down. You can kind of position them however is going to fit best for your design. Alright, and then I'm going to do
Somebody's asking if the torch has a special name or anything, but
it's just a chef's torch. This one that I'm using is the one that we have on our site, but any creme brulee torch or chef's blowtorch is going to work. I like this one specifically because the safety lock is kind of an on and off at once, so you don't have to undo the safety to turn it on every single time. So that's important. Just make sure that the one that you find is going to work really well for you and easy. Okay, so see how I'm just dipping and sticking. One here. One here. Okay, and then we'll do one more here up on the back. Just to kind of finish the whole thing off. Alright. And then I have the 2 wing feathers here that I'm going to use as his wings. So I'm just going to kind of turn him a tiny bit. These are still a little warm, so I can position them as needed. And I'm just going to figure out where I want everything first, because once you stick it, it is stuck. So I'm going to kind of figure out where I want these to sit. Dip. And stick. And I'm just going to hold that on there for a second. You can use your fan to heat that up a little bit more, or to cool that down, excuse me, a little faster if you want, but as you can see, they dry pretty instantly once it touches the Isomalt.
Sidney, can you use cold spray like you do with chocolate?
You can't use cold spray because it's Isomalt is like glass. If it goes from extreme temperature changes, it's going to shatter. So I don't like to use cold spray unless I'm going for a shattered look. Sometimes you can do that on purpose for like cracked mirrors and things like that. But I don't use cold spray. I just use my little battery operated fan, because you can see that it really doesn't need that much help. It's only in very, very quick situations where you really need things to dry instantly. Alright, Okay, so the final thing that I would like to do on my Peacock is paint him. So really, you can use anything sticky to stick onto Isomalt to paint it. You can use edible acrylic paints. You can use gel color mixed with alcohol. Just don't mix the gel color into the Isomalt, but you can paint it on top. You can use airbrushing. Airbrushing works beautifully onto Isomalt pieces. And you can also use powder. So I'm going to use my Wet n Gold the same way one that I mixed in. That way it keeps my color palette all the same. I'm going to put a little bit of that into a cup with some alcohol. You can dry dust it and it'll give it a beautiful iridescent finish, but I want to go ahead and do a little bit more intense of a color. So I'm going to just scoop some of this. Pour a little bit of alcohol in here. So I'm just using a high-proof alcohol. You can use Everclear, vodka, whatever you have.
Sydney, do you have any pieces you can show that you've had more than a few months?
I probably do, yes. Let me set him here.
Almost a year?
Yeah, I made Frankenstein, almost a year ago, probably last summer or so. So this is all Isomalt, it's all hand sculpted, and he, as you can see, is still super shiny. He has not melted or broken down, so this is just from the glaze. I can see that like a tiny bit of the tips of his hair and like on the black it's getting kind of clouded. The only reason that is because I did not respray him. If you had kept up and as soon as you start to see any little cloudiness, you can respray it with the glaze. I just didn't because he's just sitting kind of in my case behind me. But if you glaze him every time you see it getting cloudy, depending on your humidity, that could be over a few weeks or a few months, he would get back to being super shiny. So you can see nice and shiny.
Why can't you mix the gel into the Isomalt?
The gelatin is going to break down the Isomalt and it won't allow it to harden properly. So this Peacock would be sinking at this point if I had mixed gel in.
Princess would like to know, if you're using it as a cake topper, can you have the feathers cascading down, and how would you attach them?
Absolutely. So if you're using a fondant covered cake, I would do the same thing. I would just dip them in Isomalt and stick them onto the finished piece. If you are using buttercream, you can go ahead and dip and stick a support onto the back of your pieces. So if I had my feather here, I would dip a toothpick, a wire, or a piece of uncooked spaghetti, if you want an edible version, into the Isomalt, attach that to the back, and then once it's cool, you have a prong to insert into your cake. So that's what I would do for buttercream or anything soft. Alright, so I'm just painting on, just with a flat brush, kind of on a sideways angle, so that I just catch the ridges. I'm just painting some gold.
Do you have to use alcohol for painting, or can you use water as well?
You can use water. I prefer not to, just because Isomalt is still water soluble, so it's going to dissolve if you put too much water on it. So I prefer to use alcohol, something that's going to evaporate really, really quickly. And that's just my preference, but that way your pieces, you'll keep all the detail and you won't risk accidentally dissolving any fine details on it.
Do you prefer microwaving Isomalt crystals to melt?
I do. I like to, well, when I initially cook it, if you're using the powder, you have to temper it over the stove to specific temperatures. But when you have it pre-cooked, or once you already cook it yourself and you just have it in the hard candy form, then I just use the microwave. You can use the stove if you don't have a microwave, or if you prefer the stove top, that's fine. But I prefer the microwave just because it's quick and easy. I don't worry about temperatures or anything at that point. Just get it to a liquid.
Somebody wanted to know if it's heavy, but I don't know if they're talking about the bird or Frankenstein.
Frankenstein is very heavy because he's solid. The bird is really not that heavy. It's not more than a couple of pounds, just because he is hollow on the inside, so really the only weight is the base and the tail feathers. Alright, so I'm just kind of adding, with a smaller brush here, the detail onto the center of the pieces. Of course, this is kind of an artistic interpretation of a peacock, so you could go more realistic with this. You can use, different colors. This is a jeweled feather, but you could use more realistic feathers. There's so many different, it's art, right? So there's so many different ways that you can interpret it, but I will just kind of tilt this up a little bit so you guys can see the finished product here. If you guys have any final questions, go ahead and write them in the chat, and I'll answer it with my last few minutes.
How long do you wait before you spray the glaze? Do you have to be completely dry, or does it need to be done straight away?
I would spray it right now. So now that I'm done with the painting, it's all finished, I would go ahead and spray my glaze, and that is going to just lock out the humidity and make sure that it's not going to be sticky or cloudy or anything right now.
If you don't have a microwave, can you use the stove?
Yes, you absolutely can. I usually just recommend start it at a low temperature and then slowly bring the temperature up on your stove, the setting, until it is completely liquid. All right.
What about refrigeration of the cake?
I try not to refrigerate my Isomalt pieces because the moisture and the condensation when you take it out can affect it. So I would recommend putting your pieces on after it comes out of the fridge, if possible. Okay, so yeah, if you have any final questions, I can also show you really quick if you guys want to see, since I think I have about 5 minutes or so left, I wanted to show you guys really quickly another way that you can do the feathers. Let me tilt this guy back down here. Alright, so basically this is an Isomalt transfer sheet. So it is a type of icing paper, and it is printed out on an edible printer. So this is called a semi-transfer sheet, and basically you just pour the Isomalt on, the clear Isomalt. So I'm just going to do a really quick version so you guys can see if you wanted more realistic feathers. I pour a little bit into the center, and it's kind of like a chocolate transfer sheet idea, but these aren't cocoa butter. They are made for Isomalt. And you can see how if I just feather out the edges, once this cools, the transfer sheet is only going to stick where the Isomalt touches, and it will transfer that design onto your finished piece. So I'm just using my toothpick, or you can use a silicone tool like I am. I'm going to let that cool, and then once it's cool, all that Isomalt releases off, and it transfers the clear, translucent design onto your finished piece. You can see how it's already see-through here from pouring onto it. So just another idea. If you guys have any further questions as you guys are playing around with it at home, or if you're thinking of anything in the replay, please feel free to direct message me. You can write. I'm going to be going through the comments and just making sure that there's no questions that I missed, but you're always welcome to direct message me, and make sure you tag me in pictures if you use Isomalt for your creations. I'm just going to go through.
We have a few more.
Yeah, go for it.
Some Isomalt yellows.
Yes, that is going to be a thing with Isomalt because with the raw stuff, you want to make sure that you get a really, really crystal clear raw Isomalt to begin with, because some of them, I've tried whole bunches of different ones with testing when I was developing this. Some of them are just inherently yellow depending on if they put fillers into it or where it's manufactured. But another thing is going to be when you're initially tempering it, to make sure that you use all stainless steel. You want to make sure you use not tap water. You want to use distilled water and just make sure that no impurities get into it. That's going to be the main thing when making the Isomalt to keep it crystal clear.
How can Emily wants to know how she can keep the Isomalt from sticking to her gloves when she's pulling.
When you're pulling, if it's sticking to your gloves, make sure your air conditioning is on. If it's not on, then the humidity can make it sticky. But if your air conditioning is on and it's nice and cool in the room and it's still sticky, that just means that you're picking it up too quickly. So fold it on the mat longer, and it will take the stickiness away once it's ready to be picked up.
Let's see.
The wattage of light bulb that I use is a 250 watt bulb.
How do you prep the new pump?
I do have a YouTube video on how I do it if you want to see it more in depth, since we don't have time here to do it. But basically, I'm just going to take the metal pipe. This one's seasoned, as you can see, but the metal pipe before it has Isomalt on it, I put cuts in it with the scissors to make it rough, and then I dip it in liquid Isomalt after that, and then I pump as it cools, not looking at it, as it cools to make sure that the opening stays clear and the Isomalt's just on the outside. Alright, so yeah, if you have any other questions, you're welcome to message me or write them here in the chat. Thank you guys so much. Thank you again to Paul and David for having me. I can't wait to go ahead and watch all the rest of the demos today. It's so exciting. This is a really awesome event, so I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you next time. Bye!